In a clearing in the Guyanese jungle, plastic cups litter the ground like fallen leaves, their sides stained with a purple residue that smells of grape and cyanide. 909 bodies lie scattered among them, many of them children, victims of a madman who convinced them that death was salvation. This is not where our story begins, but where it ends. In Jonestown, November 18th, 1978, where Jim Jones transformed from a charismatic preacher into the architect of the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. The seeds of this tragedy were planted in rural Indiana, where a young Jim Jones spent his childhood watching his neighbors shuffle through the Great Depression like ghosts. The boy who would later command hundreds to their death was himself haunted by poverty, by his father's absence, by an obsession with death that would manifest in conducting funerals for small animals in his backyard. Even then, he understood the power of ritual, of performance, of the thin line between salvation and destruction. In his early ministry, Jones appeared to be everything his followers needed: a champion of racial integration, a healer, a father figure who promised to create heaven on earth. His People's Temple began as a beacon of hope in Indianapolis, one of the first racially integrated churches in the Midwest. Jones preached a gospel of social justice that attracted idealists, activists, and those seeking refuge from a society fractured by racism and inequality. But beneath his public persona of benevolent prophet lurked a more sinister figure. Former members describe a man who would orchestrate fake healings, pulling chicken livers from people's mouths and claiming they were cancerous tumors. He would later confess to these deceptions, telling his inner circle that he performed miracles because people needed to believe in something. This manipulation of faith would become his signature methodology. The temple's move to California in the 1960s marked a turning point. In the counterculture capital of San Francisco, Jones found fertile ground for his message of radical socialism wrapped in Christian terminology. He built political connections, befriended newspaper editors, and cultivated an image of progressive leadership. But behind closed doors, he was becoming increasingly paranoid, convinced that government agencies were plotting against him. The psychology of Jim Jones during this period reveals a man teetering on the edge of megalomania. He demanded to be called Father, insisted on sexual relationships with both male and female followers, and subjected his congregation to all-night meetings he called White Nights, where they would rehearse mass suicide. These sessions served as both psychological conditioning and loyalty tests, preparing his followers for the ultimate sacrifice he would eventually demand. Former members describe an atmosphere of escalating control. Jones monitored his followers' relationships, separated families, humiliated dissenters in public meetings, and gradually isolated his congregation from the outside world. He employed classic mind control techniques: sleep deprivation, food restriction, public confessions, and the constant threat of punishment. The temple became a world unto itself, with Jones as its sun, moon, and stars. The creation of Jonestown in Guyana was presented as the realization of a utopian dream, a socialist paradise where racial equality would reign and the evils of capitalism would be left behind. Instead, it became a prison camp in the jungle. Followers worked long hours in brutal heat, surviving on rice and beans while Jones spoke continuously over a loudspeaker system, his voice becoming the soundtrack of their lives. Survivors describe a community teetering on the edge of madness. Jones, by then heavily addicted to pharmaceuticals, would keep the settlement awake all night with rambling broadcasts. He staged fake attacks on the compound to convince his followers that outside forces were plotting against them. The paradise he promised had become a paranoid dystopia, but most followers were too isolated, too indoctrinated, and too far from home to see any way out. The final days of Jonestown were a descent into hell, choreographed by a man who had long since lost touch with reality. When Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate allegations of abuse, Jones saw it as the fulfillment of his paranoid prophecies. The congressman's murder at the Port Kaituma airstrip was the point of no return, the match that would ignite the inferno Jones had been building for years. The death scene itself defies simple description. Mothers injected poison into their children's mouths before taking it themselves. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion where Jones gathered his followers, ensuring that his final act of domination would be complete. Jones himself did not drink the poison. He was found with a gunshot wound to the head, a last act of separation from his followers, even in death. The recordings from that final hour reveal the ultimate horror of mind control, hundreds of people calmly lining up to kill themselves and their children, while Jones urges them on, calling it a revolutionary act. The sound of children crying gradually fades as the poison takes effect, replaced by Jones's voice continuing to preach until the very end. The psychological autopsy of Jonestown reveals layers of manipulation so complex that decades later, scholars still debate how Jones achieved such complete control over his followers. He combined elements of religion, politics, and personal charisma to create a web of belief so strong that even the most basic human instinct, survival, could be overridden by his commands. The aftermath left wounds that have never fully healed. Families were devastated, survivors were traumatized, and the very concept of religious freedom came under scrutiny. The term "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the lexicon as a dark reminder of how belief can be weaponized against believers. In the end, the story of Jim Jones and People's Temple is not just about one man's descent into madness or even the tragic deaths of his followers. It's about the dangerous alchemy that occurs when faith meets fear, when devotion meets desperation, when the promise of paradise becomes a prison.